The Dancing Plague of 1518. History isn't always written by generals and kings. Sometimes it's written by feet. Feet that just won't stop. In July of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman known as Frau Trophea stepped out of her house and into the sweltering summer heat. And she began to dance. Not with joy, not for a festival, but with a frantic, desperate energy. There was no music, there was no partner. There was only the relentless, compulsive rhythm of her own body. Her husband begged her to stop. She couldn't. For 6 straight days, she danced, her face a mask of exhaustion and agony, her limbs jerking in a macabre parody of celebration. This wasn't a solo performance. Within a week, 33 others had joined her, their bodies seized by the same bizarre compulsion. By August, the number of dancers had swelled to over 400. The city authorities were, to put it mildly, stumped. Their diagnosis, based on the deeply flawed medical logic of the time, was hot blood. Their prescription? More dancing. They genuinely believed the afflicted needed to dance the fever out of their systems. So they cleared out guild halls, erected a wooden stage in the grain market, and even hired professional musicians to provide a soundtrack for the unfolding nightmare. It was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The constant music and designated dance floors only seemed to legitimize the mania, encouraging more people to join the writhing, sweating masses. This wasn't a party. It was a slow-motion catastrophe. People were dancing until their wooden clogs and leather shoes disintegrated, then continued on bloody, swollen feet. They were collapsing from dehydration, starving from an inability to stop for food, and suffering massive heart attacks and strokes. At its peak, the plague was claiming up to 15 lives per day. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of people, eyes glazed over, bodies slick with sweat, jerking and spasming uncontrollably in the city square while officials and loved ones watch in helpless horror. This wasn't hysteria, it was a biological siege. So what in the world was going on? For centuries, the easy answer was mass hysteria or mass psychogenic illness. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 were not having a good time. They were grappling with extreme famine, poverty, and rampant diseases like smallpox and syphilis. The theory goes that the immense psychological stress simply became too much to bear, and it exploded outwards in this physical manifestation. The shared trauma created a horrifying feedback loop, a social contagion of despair expressed through motion. But there's a more compelling and more terrifying scientific theory: ergotism. Ergot is a type of fungus that grows on damp rye, the primary grain used for bread in the region. When consumed, ergot alkaloids can have devastating effects. One form, convulsive ergotism, produces violent muscle spasms, twitching, and tremors, a grotesque, uncontrollable dance. Another compound in ergot is lysergic acid, from which LSD is derived. The victims might not just have been dancing, they could have been trapped in a month-long, agonizing psychedelic trip, their minds tormented by hallucinations while their bodies were tortured by spasms. This theory perfectly explains the frantic, involuntary nature of the dancing and the sheer endurance of the victims, pushed beyond normal human limits by a powerful neurotoxin. The dancing plague wasn't a choice or a psychological quirk. It was likely a mass poisoning, a horrifying chapter of history written by a microscopic fungus that turned an entire city into its unwilling puppets. The Great Emu War. In 1932, the Australian government officially declared war on birds, and the birds won. This isn't the setup for a joke, it's the humiliating, almost unbelievable story of the Great Emu War. After World War I, Australia gave returning soldiers plots of land in Western Australia to farm wheat. It was a noble idea, but the land was marginal, the conditions were tough, and the Great Depression was making things even harder. Then came the emus, 20,000 of them. Migrating inland after their breeding season, this giant flock of flightless birds discovered the farmers' new wheat fields. To them, it wasn't a struggling veteran's livelihood. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet. They were a perfect pest. They ate the wheat, knocked down fences allowing rabbits to get in, and were generally a massive, feathered nuisance. The beleaguered farmers, many of them ex-soldiers, petitioned the government for help. They requested machine guns. And in a decision that will forever live in infamy, the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce, agreed. He reasoned that the emus would be good target practice for the military. So, the Royal Australian Artillery, under the command of Major G.P.W. Meredith, was deployed. They came armed with 2 Lewis automatic machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. On one side, the might of the Commonwealth military. On the other, big, dumb-looking birds. It should have been a slaughter. It was a farce. The first attempt, on November 2nd, was a failure. The soldiers spotted a flock, but the birds were out of range. Later, they located a group of about 1,000 emus. This was it. The gunners opened fire. But the Lewis guns, designed for static trench warfare, were wildly inaccurate against fast-moving, unpredictable targets. After blasting through hundreds of rounds, the official body count was a pathetic dozen emus. The rest had scattered, seemingly unbothered. One soldier noted with grudging respect that the emu's code of tactics is an order of scattering. They were like feathered gorillas. The military's crowning humiliation came a few days later. Major Meredith's men mounted one of the Lewis guns onto a truck, thinking they could chase the emus down. The result was a slapstick comedy scene. The truck bounced so violently over the rough terrain that the gunner couldn't aim. The emus, capable of sprinting at 30 miles per hour, easily outran the vehicle. At no point did the truck manage to get close enough for a clean shot. They burned through ammunition and fuel and didn't kill a single bird. They were outmaneuvered, outrun, and outsmarted. Major Meredith himself seemed in awe of his enemy. He reported that each emu flock had a leader, a tall, black-plumed bird, that would keep watch while the others caused destruction, giving a warning call at the first sign of danger. He compared them to Zulu warriors, praising their surprising invulnerability to bullets. Even when hit, the emus would often just shake it off and keep running. As one soldier put it, they had the armor plating of a tank. After a week of this embarrassing failure, with less than 100 emus killed and thousands of rounds spent, the media got wind of it. The press had a field day, mocking the government's war and turning the emus into national heroes. A conservationist in Parliament dryly asked if a medal would be awarded to the emus for their victory. Facing public ridicule, the military withdrew. Major Meredith and his men packed up their guns and went home, defeated by an enemy with a brain the size of a walnut. The farmers were left to fend for themselves, and the emus kept eating the wheat. The Great Emu War stands as a timeless, hilarious, and humbling reminder. Never ever underestimate your opponent, especially when they have feathers. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic. Laughter is supposed to be the best medicine. But in 1962, in the newly independent nation of Tanganyika, now Tanzania, it was the disease. This was not the happy, contagious laughter of a shared joke. This was a neurological epidemic, a bizarre, unstoppable laughing fit that paralyzed a region for over a year. It all began on January 30th, 1962, in a mission-run all-girls boarding school in the village of Kashasha. 3 students started laughing, and they couldn't stop. The laughter was infectious, but not in a fun way. It spread through the school like a virus. Soon, 95 of the school's 159 pupils were caught in its grip, laughing and crying uncontrollably for hours, even days at a time. The attacks were incapacitating. The girls were exhausted, in pain, and unable to focus on their studies. With nearly 2/3 of its student body afflicted, the school had no choice but to shut down on March 18th. Closing the school, however, only spread the plague. The students were sent back to their home villages, becoming carriers of this strange affliction. The epidemic followed them. In the village of Nshamba, several of the girls infected their families and neighbors. Over the next 2 months, 217 people in the village were gripped by these relentless laughing attacks. The symptoms were consistent: bouts of laughter, often accompanied by crying, restlessness, and agitation. The fits could last from a few hours to over 2 weeks. It was a mass psychogenic illness, a psychic virus hopping from person to person. The panic spread faster than the laughter. Local authorities had no idea what to do. Was it a poison? A curse? Schools in the surrounding areas were closed down as a precaution. The original school in Kashasha tried to reopen in May, but the epidemic immediately broke out again, forcing it to close for good. By the middle of the year, the laughter epidemic had spread to the Ramashenya Girls Middle School, infecting another 48 students. In total, the epidemic touched more than 1,000 people and forced the closure of 14 different schools. It lasted for a staggering 18 months before finally, inexplicably, petering out. What on earth could cause such a thing? There were no toxins found, no viruses identified. The leading theory today is that it was a case of mass psychogenic illness, or MPI, triggered by immense stress. Consider the context. These weren't just any schoolgirls. They were young women in a brand new, uncertain country, under intense pressure to succeed in a strict, European-style Catholic boarding school. The expectations were high, the rules were rigid, and the future was unknown. The epidemic began just 1 month after Tanganyika gained its independence from Britain, a time of massive social and political upheaval. The theory suggests that this pent-up stress and anxiety needed an outlet, and it found one in the most bizarre way possible. Laughter, in this case, wasn't an expression of joy, but a release valve for unbearable tension. Once the first few students started, the social pressure and shared environment created a feedback loop. Seeing your classmates, your only social group in a closed environment, succumb to this strange behavior made you more susceptible to it yourself. It was a socially transmitted coping mechanism, gone haywire. The laughter wasn't the problem, it was a symptom of a much deeper anxiety that the community had no other way to express. It was the sound of a culture under immense pressure, finally breaking. The War of the Oaken Bucket. Wars have been fought over land, religion, honor, and resources. But in 1325, in northern Italy, 2 city-states fought a full-scale war over a wooden bucket. And it wasn't even a particularly nice bucket. This is the story of the War of the Oaken Bucket, a conflict that proves that humanity's capacity for pettiness is truly infinite. The 2 combatants were Modena and Bologna. For centuries, they had been bitter rivals. Their feud was part of a larger, incredibly complex political struggle that was tearing Italy apart. The fight between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. To oversimplify a very complicated mess, the Guelphs supported the Pope, and the Ghibellines supported the Holy Roman Emperor. Bologna was staunchly Guelph. Modena was fiercely Ghibelline. They were ideological opposites who also happened to be neighbors, which is always a recipe for disaster. They were constantly raiding each other's territory, stealing livestock, and generally behaving like the world's most violent homeowners association. The story goes that in 1325, a small group of soldiers from Modena snuck into the city center of Bologna and stole the oaken bucket from the main city well. It was an act of trolling, a medieval prank designed to humiliate their rivals. They succeeded. Bologna was furious. They demanded the immediate return of their bucket. Modena, enjoying the spectacle, refused. So Bologna declared war. Now, it's important to understand that the bucket was probably not the real reason for the war. It was the catalyst, the final insult in a long line of grievances. It was the symbolic embodiment of decades of hatred. But it was, officially, the entire point. Bologna amassed a massive army of 32,000 men and marched on Modena to get their bucket back. This was a huge force for the era. They were not messing around. Modena, outnumbered, could only muster an army of 7,000. The 2 forces met at Zappolino in what would become one of the bloodiest battles of the Italian Middle Ages. For 2 hours, the battle raged. Despite being outnumbered more than 4-1, the Modenese forces were better led and had a stronger cavalry. They not only held their ground, but completely routed the Bolognese army. The soldiers of Bologna panicked and fled, with the Modenese chasing them all the way back to the gates of their own city. The Modenese added insult to injury. They didn't try to take the city, but they did spend several days outside the walls, taunting their defeated enemies and, in a final act of humiliation, stealing a second bucket from a well just outside the city gates. The battle was a disaster for Bologna. An estimated 2,000 men were killed on both sides, all for a bucket. And the punchline to this whole bloody affair? Modena kept the bucket. They still have it. It's on display in the Torre della Ghirlandina, the bell tower of the Modena Cathedral. It hangs there as a permanent 700-year-old symbol of their victory, a constant reminder to their neighbors of the time they got their butts kicked over a piece of basic household equipment. The war didn't solve the rivalry, of course. The fighting continued for years, but it gave us one of history's most absurd and cautionary tales. Never let a simple dispute escalate, especially when it involves buckets. The Boston Molasses Flood. On January 15, 1919, a date that would live in sticky infamy, the north end of Boston was destroyed by a breakfast condiment. This wasn't a fire. It wasn't a bomb. It was a 25-foot-high tidal wave of molasses, moving at 35 miles per hour. At 529 Commercial Street stood a colossal steel tank, 5 stories tall and 90 feet wide. It belonged to the Purity Distilling Company, and it held more than 2.3 million gallons of crude molasses. The company was rushing to process the molasses into industrial alcohol, which was a key component in munitions manufacturing during World War I. They were cutting corners to meet demand, and the tank was a ticking time bomb. Local residents said the tank groaned and shuddered every time it was filled. It leaked so much that children would collect the sweet drippings in cans. The company's response was to paint the tank brown so the leaks were less visible. This is a level of corporate negligence that is almost poetic. Just after noon on that unseasonably warm January day, with a sound like a machine gun barrage, the rivets holding the tank's steel plates together shot out. The tank ruptured. 2.3 million gallons of thick, viscous goo erupted outwards in a catastrophic wave. It was a literal tsunami of sugar. The initial force of the blast was so powerful it buckled the girders of the elevated railway nearby and knocked a train off its tracks. Buildings were smashed to splinters and swept off their foundations. The wave of molasses, weighing an incredible 13,000 tons, was an unstoppable force. The real horror wasn't just the impact, it was the aftermath. People who were swept up by the wave were either crushed or worse, drowned. The thick, syrupy liquid filled their lungs, making rescue and resuscitation impossible. Horses from a nearby stable were caught in the flood and died where they stood. As the winter air cooled the molasses, it began to thicken, creating a deadly, sticky trap. The streets of Boston were transformed into a giant sheet of flypaper. Rescuers trying to reach the victims found themselves trapped, wading through a hip-deep morass of brown sludge that pulled the boots right off their feet. The scene was a surreal nightmare, the air thick with a sickeningly sweet smell, the ground a treacherous landscape of sticky death, and the screams of the trapped and injured echoing through the streets. In the end, 21 people were killed, and 150 were injured. The cleanup was a monumental task. It took over 87,000 man-hours to chip and wash away all the molasses. Firefighters used salt water pumped from the harbor to spray down the streets, which just left the entire north end covered in a thin, sticky brown film. For decades afterwards, on hot summer days, residents claimed they could still smell the faint, sweet scent of molasses in the air. This bizarre tragedy led to one of the first and most significant class action lawsuits in American history. The victims and their families sued the Purity Distilling Company's parent corporation, United States Industrial Alcohol. The company, of course, tried to blame anarchists, claiming the tank had been sabotaged. But after a lengthy investigation, the court found the company entirely at fault. The tank was shoddily constructed, never properly tested, and fatally weakened by the constant fermentation happening inside. The company paid out what would be the equivalent of millions of dollars today to the victims. The Great Molasses Flood was more than just a freak accident. It was a powerful and sticky lesson in the deadly consequences of corporate greed and a landmark moment in holding businesses accountable for their negligence. The 1904 Olympic Marathon. The modern Olympic Games are a showcase of peak human performance. The 1904 Olympic Marathon, held in St. Louis, was a showcase of absolute unmitigated chaos. It was less of an athletic competition and more of a bizarre, dangerous, and often hilarious medical experiment gone wrong. It's a miracle anyone survived at all. The race was held on a blistering hot August day with temperatures soaring over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The course was a dusty, hilly country road. There were only 2 water stops on the entire 25-mile course. This wasn't a test of endurance. It was a recipe for heat stroke. The race organizer, James Sullivan, had a pet theory. He wanted to test the limits of purposeful dehydration. He was curious to see what would happen. What happened was a disaster. Of the 32 runners who started the race, only 14 finished. The rest were casualties of the heat, the dust, and some of the worst decisions ever made in sports history. The eventual winner, an American named Thomas Hicks, was a walking chemistry set. His support team was feeding him a cocktail of strychnine, a literal rat poison, and brandy. Strychnine in small doses acts as a stimulant. By the end of the race, Hicks was hallucinating. His trainers had to physically carry him over the finish line, his legs moving in a running motion while he was held aloft. He won the gold medal and then immediately collapsed. It took 4 doctors to revive him, but Hicks wasn't even the first person to cross the finish line. That honor went to another American, Fred Lors. Lors was greeted with cheers, and Alice Roosevelt, the president's daughter, was about to place the laurel wreath on his head when a spectator yelled out that he was a cheat. It turned out Lors had cramped up around the 9-mile mark, hitched a ride in his manager's car for the next 11 miles, and then, when the car broke down, hopped out and jogged the rest of the way to the finish. When confronted, he claimed it was all a joke. He was banned for life, though the ban was later lifted because his apology was apparently very sincere. The other competitors didn't fare much better. William Garcia of California was found lying on the side of the road, bleeding internally from the dust he had inhaled, which had torn his stomach lining. He almost died. Another runner, John Lorden, suffered a severe bout of vomiting and retired. The most famous story is that of Andarin Carvajal, a Cuban mailman who had lost all his money in New Orleans and had to hitchhike to St. Louis. He ran in street clothes, having cut his trousers into shorts. He hadn't eaten in 40 hours. Along the route, he got hungry, so he stopped in an orchard to eat some apples. The apples turned out to be rotten. He got severe stomach cramps and had to take a nap on the side of the road. Despite all this, he still managed to finish in 4th place. And then there were the 2 runners from South Africa, Len Tau and John Mashieni. They were the first black Africans to compete in the Olympics. They were expected to do well, but were chased nearly a mile off course by a pack of aggressive dogs. Despite this canine-enforced detour, Tau still managed to finish 9th. The 1904 marathon was such an unmitigated disaster that it nearly led to the event being abolished from the Olympics for good. It stands as a testament to human foolishness, the dangers of junk science, and the incredible, almost suicidal determination of a few very strange athletes. The Great Stink of London. In the summer of 1858, the most powerful city on earth was brought to its knees by a smell. Not just a bad smell, but a monumental, apocalyptic stench that threatened to make the city of London uninhabitable. This was the Great Stink, a crisis so profound it forced a reluctant government to build one of the greatest engineering marvels of the 19th century. For centuries, London had treated the River Thames as its personal toilet. All of the city's waste, from household sewage to industrial chemicals to the runoff from slaughterhouses, went directly into the river. For a long time, the river was able to handle it. But by the mid-19th century, London's population had exploded to over 2 million people, and the widespread adoption of the flushing toilet had massively increased the volume of raw sewage pouring into the Thames. The river was no longer a flowing body of water, it was a thick, brown, open sewer. The summer of 1858 was unusually hot and dry. The river level dropped, exposing the banks of thick, black, decomposing sludge to the summer sun. The heat cooked the waste, releasing a plume of toxic, gag-inducing fumes that settled over the entire city. The smell was described as a combination of hydrogen sulfide, methane, and every other foul odor imaginable. It was so overpowering that people walking along the river would be struck with fits of vomiting. It infiltrated every home, every business, and even the hallowed halls of Parliament, which is conveniently located right on the banks of the Thames. The government, for a time, tried to pretend the problem didn't exist. But the stink was relentless. In the House of Commons, they tried soaking the curtains in chloride of lime to mask the smell. It didn't work. The stench was so bad that they considered abandoning Westminster altogether and moving the entire government to Oxford. This was more than just an inconvenience, it was a matter of life and death. The prevailing scientific theory of the time was the miasma theory, which held that diseases like cholera and typhoid were spread by bad smells. London was terrified that the Great Stink was a precursor to a massive plague that would wipe out the city. The city was in a full-blown panic. This is where Joseph Bazalgette enters the story. Bazalgette was a brilliant civil engineer with a bold vision. He argued that the only way to save London was to build a completely new, city-wide sewer system that would intercept all the waste before it reached the river and carry it far downstream, to be released into the sea on the outgoing tide. It was an incredibly ambitious and expensive plan. For years, the government had balked at the cost. But the Great Stink changed everything. With the city grinding to a halt and politicians literally holding their noses in Parliament, a bill to fund Bazalgette's sewer system was pushed through in a record 18 days. The project was a masterpiece of engineering and foresight. Bazalgette built 82 miles of massive underground brick tunnels to serve as the main interceptor sewers, connected to over 1,100 miles of local street sewers. He insisted on using the highest quality Portland cement and designed the tunnels to be egg-shaped, which provided the best flow and prevented blockages. And in an act of genius, he calculated the sewer capacity needed for the densest population imaginable, and then said, "We'll double it," ensuring his system would last for generations. He built not just for the London of his time, but for the London of the future. The system he designed in the 1860s is still the backbone of London's sanitation system today. The Great Stink was a moment of profound crisis, but it was also the catalyst for one of the most important public health advancements in history, proving that sometimes you have to hit rock bottom before you're willing to build your way out. The battle for Castle Itter. On May 5, 1945, just 5 days after Hitler's suicide and 2 days before Germany's unconditional surrender, one of the strangest battles of World War II took place. In it, a handful of American soldiers, a German army major, and a group of French VIP prisoners fought side by side to defend a medieval castle against an assault by the Waffen-SS. It was the only battle in the war where American and German troops fought as allies. The setting was Castle Itter, a small but formidable fortress perched on a hilltop in Austria. The Nazis had converted it into a high-profile prison, a gilded cage for a collection of French political prisoners. These weren't common criminals. They were former prime ministers, top generals, a tennis star, and even the sister of General Charles de Gaulle. As the Third Reich crumbled, the regular prison guards abandoned their posts, leaving the French prisoners to their fate. But they weren't safe. A fanatical unit of the Waffen-SS, still roaming the countryside and refusing to surrender, was determined to execute them all. The prisoners managed to get a message out to the Austrian resistance, which in turn contacted the American forces that were just arriving in the area. Captain John Jack Lee, a decorated American tank commander, volunteered to lead a rescue mission. But he only had a handful of men and a single Sherman tank named Besotten Jenny. He knew it wasn't enough. On his way to the castle, he encountered a German army officer, Major Josef Sepp Gangl. Gangl was a Wehrmacht officer, not a Nazi. He despised the SS and had been working with the Austrian resistance. When Lee explained the situation, Gangl didn't hesitate. He and the remnants of his unit, about 10 German soldiers, pledged to help the Americans defend the castle. So this bizarre, cobbled-together force arrived at Castle Itter. A few Americans, a dozen Germans, the French prisoners, some of whom were old soldiers themselves, and Gangl's command. They set up a hasty defense, placing the Sherman tank at the main gate and positioning themselves at the windows of the castle keep. They were a band of sworn enemies, united by a common foe and a common sense of decency. The SS attack came in the early morning. They were a hardened, well-equipped force, and they laid siege to the castle with machine guns, anti-tank rockets, and an 88mm cannon. The fighting was furious. The defenders were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The Sherman tank was quickly destroyed by the 88, but it had bought them precious time. All day they held off the SS assaults, fighting from the castle's battlements like a scene from the Middle Ages. The French prisoners fought alongside their German and American protectors. Edouard Daladier, a former French prime minister, was seen firing a machine gun from a window. Tragically, Major Gangl, the German officer who had bravely joined the Americans, was killed by an SS sniper while trying to move a French prisoner out of harm's way. He died a hero, fighting to save the lives of his country's former enemies. As the defenders ran low on ammunition and the SS prepared for a final, overwhelming assault, salvation arrived. A relief force of American tanks, alerted to the battle, finally broke through and routed the SS. The battle for Castle Itter was over. This single, surreal event stands as a powerful testament to the fact that, even in the darkest of conflicts, shared humanity can sometimes bridge the widest of divides, creating allies in the most unlikely of places. The Pig War. In 1859, the United States and the British Empire, the two most powerful English-speaking nations on Earth, went to the brink of war over a dead pig. The dispute was about land, specifically the San Juan Islands, a small archipelago located between Vancouver Island and the North American mainland. A treaty signed in 1846 had set the border between the US and British North America at the 49th parallel, but it got fuzzy when it reached the water, drawing the line through the middle of the channel that separates the mainland from Vancouver Island. The problem was there are two channels, and both the US and Britain claimed the islands in between were rightfully theirs. For a while, this ambiguity didn't matter much, but then settlers arrived. The British Hudson's Bay Company set up a sheep ranch on San Juan Island, and a couple dozen American settlers also showed up to stake their claim. The two groups coexisted, but it was tense. The stage was set for a conflict, and the trigger was a potato-loving pig. On June 15, 1859, an American farmer named Lyman Cutler went out to his garden and found a large black pig, owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, eating his potatoes. This wasn't the first time. Cutler was fed up. He took his rifle and shot the pig. He then went to the British manager of the ranch, Charles Griffin, and offered to pay for the pig. Cutler offered $10. Griffin, incensed, demanded $100. Cutler rescinded his offer, saying he wouldn't pay a cent for a pig that was trespassing and eating his crops. Griffin responded by threatening to have Cutler arrested by the British authorities. The American settlers, alarmed at the prospect of being arrested by the British on what they considered American soil, petitioned the U.S. military for protection. The man who answered the call was Captain George Pickett. Yes, that George Pickett, who would later lead the disastrous Pickett's Charge at the Battle of Gettysburg. Pickett was a man of action, not diplomacy. He landed on the island with a company of 66 soldiers and declared it to be American territory. The British responded by sending 3 warships to the island under the command of Captain Geoffrey Hornby. The situation escalated dramatically. Pickett refused to back down. Soon, the Americans had over 460 men and 14 cannons dug in on the island, while the British had 5 warships and over 2,000 men in the harbor. The two sides were locked in a tense standoff. Captain Hornby was ordered by the hot-headed British governor to land his Marines and engage the Americans. Hornby, seeing the potential for a catastrophic, full-scale war, wisely refused, deciding to wait for orders from his superior, Rear Admiral Robert Baines. When Admiral Baines arrived and learned that the two global superpowers were about to start shooting at each other over a pig, he was appalled. He famously told the governor, "It would be foolish to involve two great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig." News of the crisis eventually reached Washington, D.C. and London. Both governments, horrified at how close their local commanders had come to starting a war, immediately entered into negotiations. They agreed to a joint military occupation of the island until the border dispute could be settled through diplomacy. For the next 12 years, a small contingent of British Royal Marines and a company of U.S. soldiers lived peacefully on San Juan Island, a few miles apart. They reportedly got along quite well, visiting each other's camps for holidays and sporting events. Finally, in 1872, the dispute was sent to international arbitration, with Kaiser Wilhelm III of Germany chosen as the mediator. He ruled in favor of the United States, granting them the San Juan Islands and officially ending one of the most tense and most absurd confrontations in military history: the year without a summer. The year 1816 was a year of darkness, a year of frost in July, of failed crops and mass famine, of blood-red snow and spectral sunsets. Across the northern hemisphere, it was the year the sun seemed to die. It became known as the year without a summer, a global climate catastrophe that no one at the time could explain. The cause lay half a world away on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa. In April of 1815, a volcano named Mount Tambora had erupted. This wasn't just any eruption, it was the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded human history, a cataclysm 100 times more powerful than the eruption of Vesuvius that buried Pompeii. It blasted an estimated 36 cubic miles of rock, ash, and gas into the atmosphere. The immediate effects were devastating, killing tens of thousands of people in the surrounding islands. But the long-term global consequences were even more profound. The eruption shot a colossal plume of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. There, it mixed with water vapor to form a thin veil of sulfate aerosols that spread around the globe. This veil acted like a dirty mirror, reflecting sunlight back into space and causing global temperatures to plummet. The world's climate was thrown into chaos. In North America, the effects were stark and terrifying. A persistent dry fog dimmed the sunlight. Snow fell in Quebec in June. A hard frost hit New England in August, killing off the corn and potato crops. Farmers who had planted their fields saw their livelihoods wither and die. The price of grain skyrocketed. People were forced to eat raccoons, mackerel, and boiled nettles to survive. This agricultural crisis spurred a massive wave of migration, as desperate families from the East Coast packed up and headed west in search of a better climate, reshaping the demographic map of the United States. Europe was hit even harder. The constant rain and cold weather led to catastrophic crop failures. In Ireland, it triggered a typhus epidemic that killed 65,000 people. In Switzerland, the famine was so bad that people were seen eating moss and cats. The streets were filled with beggars, and food riots broke out across Britain, France, and Germany. The social and political turmoil was immense. But this year of darkness also had a strange, creative silver lining. The atmospheric dust created spectacular, brilliantly colored sunsets, which were captured in the moody, dramatic paintings of the artist J.M.W. Turner. And in Switzerland, a group of English writers, trapped indoors by the ceaseless rain at a villa on Lake Geneva, decided to pass the time by telling ghost stories. One of them, a young woman named Mary Shelley, was inspired by the gloomy atmosphere and the recent scientific experiments with electricity to write a story about a reanimated corpse. That story became Frankenstein. Another guest, Lord Byron's personal physician John Polidori, wrote The Vampire, a story that would directly influence Bram Stoker's Dracula decades later. Two of the most iconic monsters in all of literature were born from the gloom of The Year Without a Summer. It was a stark lesson in global interconnectedness, a terrifying demonstration of how an event on one side of the planet could plunge the other into darkness, famine, and monstrous creativity.